On a gray morning when the road smelled of rain and dust, the man stood by the gate and folded his coat around a memory. He moved with the careful speed of a thing rehearsed, keys in one pocket, silence in the other, and the cat watched from the low wall with eyes like two small clocks measuring how long a single heartbeat could hold. Nothing about the movement suggested farewell. The man's hands were as habitual as a prayer, his jaw set like a hinge. Yet the cat felt in a place that was not quite whisker and not quite bone, an ending arrive as if carried on the hush between two heartbeats. The world narrowed to the gate and the slow swing of the man's shoulders. A single suitcase side open, closed, and side again. The cat did not follow. It sat still, a patient witness, while the door closed and the echo of the latch fell like a small, precise bell inside its chest. In that silence, something terrible and tender unlatched. The ordinary world that had held both of them began to tilt. Outside, the day learned how to be different today. The house had been a reliable thing for many winters, a stack of rooms that remembered where the light fell and where the drafts liked to sleep. It kept its old bones honest, and the man kept his lean habits like a litany against forgetting. He rose at dawn to the kettle's small bellow, to the slow prosthetic of the garden clock, to the letters folded into the soft dark of a drawer that smelled faintly of lavender and smoke. He had been alone a long while by the measures people use, though not alone by the measures that mattered. The cat was an ordinance in his life, a presence that arranged itself around the house's familiar failures, mending them without fuss. He had lost much, a wife once, to a winter where the sun hid for weeks. A son in a sudden forgetting that was more river than story. Names that rolled like empty coins whenever he tried to set them in his mouth. Grief had taught him to do things carefully, to place a cup so it would not ring, to leave a crumb in the bowl because the cat expected it, to water the rosemary on the sill which he spoke to in the same low voice he used when reading maps of places he would never go. The rosemary leaned toward the window as if listening for footsteps. Plants to him were the only hopeful thing left that could be patient and bear the weight of small rituals without complaint. The cat was not given to grand gestures. It entered the house the way a thought enters a room, without announcing itself until it had already altered the shape of the air. When the man woke, there was the cat on the hearth with salt light in its fur, folding itself into angles that matched the corners of the man's life. The animal learned the map of his days by behavior. It sat on the paper when he tried to write, not to spoil the words, but to insist on a pause. It tapped the salt shaker with a tentative paw when he set it down. It cleaned the corner of his sleeve with the reverence of one who knows the value of gentleness. It kept watch at the window when storms came, not to hunt but to keep the house informed of what the world might do next. They were small accomplices. The man spoke to the cat in short sentences, not out of necessity but out of courtesy, the way one might announce a decision to a dear elder. He read aloud sometimes, old newsprint with the edges feathered, and the cat would close its eyes as if listening not to the words but to the cadence of the voice. Meals were made with ceremony, a small saucer set down precisely at the same place, the man pausing to lift the lid for the aroma before handing it to the animal. The cat rubbing its head against the man's ankle in thanks, the man tracing the cat's ear with the tip of a thumb like a benediction. These movements were ordinary and therefore sacred. Outside, the garden carried the slow testimony of years. A rosebush, once abundant, had learned to be modest after a season of neglect. The rosemary on the sill was an aging sentinel. A single potted ivy climbed the lattice at the back and had, by its patient work, threaded green through the weathered wood, as if it meant to hold the house together. The ivy had been planted the year the woman the man loved had left her mark on the place. A tiny smear of soil on the rim of the pot, a laugh that seemed to remain lodged in the leaves. When she was gone, the man tended the ivy with a measured touch, and it grew in the kind of way that remembers names, leaning always toward the room where she once sat. There were things in the house meant to steady memory. A brass key that did not fit any lock but clicked pleasingly in the man's palm, a photograph with corners softened to the color of tea, a teacup with the tiniest hairline crack that the man never threw away because he could not bear to lose even that small history. Each object was a plant in the garden of remembrance, seeded and watered by ritual. The cat would sometimes sit upon the photograph as if to guard the face, not to obscure it, but to keep it warm. The man would say, "Not yet," to the photograph when it seemed as though the past might bleed into the present. and the cat would look at him as if to say, "We will keep you." Then, they survived like this, a man and a cat arranged in the same old room, the house a ledger in which small debts of affection were paid in time. The man found comfort in the cat's constancy. The cat found convenience in the man's patterns. Neither had much to say about the future. The man's steps had a language of caution that belied the restlessness knotted beneath. There were days when he walked to the gate and stood with his hand on the latch as though listening to the road. On other days he would sit by the window and watch the town make its modest business of days and markets and people leaving on errands that did not include him. He watched the lavender stripe of evening come on slowly, then retreat. He watched the shadow of the chimneys slide like slow hands across the courtyard. The cat watched these things differently, not as a man waiting for someone, but as a being noting the rhythm of the house and the small changes in its pulse. This rhythm had a solidity born of repetition. The man sorted his clothes on Saturday like a priest preparing vestments. He fed the bird at dawn and the cat at noon. He mended the chair that had a slight lean to the left. He opened the same creaking window each morning to let a breath of world slip into the back room. There were habits that passed between them like coins of exchange. The morning heel nudge by the cat, the evening hand scratch under the chin. Even the way the man put his hat on his head felt negotiated by the cat, which would sometimes jump to the brim and perch there for a moment like a small weathercock. And yet, under the measured surface there was a fissure. The man carried appointments written on the back of envelopes like talismans, and there were visits that made his hand tremble slightly as he put down the kettle. A letter he had received some weeks past lived in the pocket of his coat, even though he had not yet opened it. It made the coat feel heavier at the shoulder, and he would smooth the fabric in small protective motions as if to reassure himself that whatever shelter was left would not abandon him. He spoke less to other people, more to the rosemary and the cat, and more to the pale patch of wall where once a laughter had left a shadow. The cat noticed these things as a cat might notice a change in the weather, by adjusting its position, not out of panic but out of preparedness. It began to sit longer at the kitchen door, tail wrapped tightly, watching the path the man took when he left to gather the newspaper or to buy bread. When the man set down the keys at night, the cat would press its forehead lightly against them as if to take the scent of the world he had visited. The animal had a way of waiting that made waiting feel less like absence and more like accompaniment. One evening, the man came home later than usual. The light in the window had thinned into something fragile. He moved with a slowness that suggested a decision had been made elsewhere and returned to him in pieces. He sat at the table and placed a folded leaflet on the surface, smoothing it as if one smooths a bird's wing. The cat hopped up, as it always did, and very deliberately touched the leaflet with its paw. The man looked at the cat, then at the leaflet, and in that look there was a small and terrible tenderness. He did not speak much that night. He filled a cup and let it steam and cool. He put the kettle away even though he had not drunk from it. The radio murmured a distant program about markets and weather, and the man seemed to steer his attention around the words. He rose and paced once down the length of the corridor, the floorboards under his feet knowing his weight and the old dent in the wood remembering the years. When he opened the bedroom door, he paused and, as if summoning courage from a lower drawer, he reached for a box in the wardrobe that contained a scarf she had worn, the scarf with a faint perfume that still clung like a memory rotund in the empty sleeve of the coat. The cat watched him collect these things with the attention of one who records events for late-night telling. That night the man did not sleep well. He lay awake, feeling the house breathe around him and thinking of arrangements that made his chest feel tight as if someone had gently wrapped a bandage there. He rose early and filled his coat with more than the usual number of small things. A hat, the photograph with softened corners, a comb, the brass key that pleased his palm. He spoke softly as he folded the scarf into a careful parcel and put it on the bedside table where the cat could reach and sniff. The animal did so, with a small and exact sniff as though to verify that the scent had not left entirely. On the morning he left, the atmosphere in the house took on the density of a rite. The kettle whistled with the same note it always had, but the man did not pour the water into a cup and sit. Instead, he tied the knot in his scarf with hands that trembled only once, then steadied. The cat sat on the hearth, the way it had since the house had learned to hold both of them. It watched the man not with the blunt hunger of a hunter, nor with the brute curiosity of a stranger. but with the cautious gravity of one who understands the importance of the smallest gestures. Outside, the road smelt of rain and dust. Inside, the rosemary on the sill leaned as if to lend its small green strength to the man. He stood at the gate and glanced back at the house, fingers resting briefly on the latch as though checking a pulse. The cat wound itself around his boots once, as if to bind him. For a moment the man lifted his hand and rested it on the cat's head, the thumb finding the familiar hollow behind the ear. It was an old and private benediction. Then he let go. He walked down the path with the measured rhythm of someone performing a last courteous act. There was no shouting, no dramatic haste. The leaving was like the final page turned carefully in an old book. The cat watched until the shape of the man diminished to a point and then to nothing. The gate closed, a small finality. The door relatched. The echo of the latch fell into the house. That fall of sound was the inciting incident. It opened the story into a new room where the man's absence was a palpable thing, where the ordinary world had, for an instant, been made unfamiliar. The house exhaled a small, almost inaudible grief, and the cat felt the gravity of that new room settle around its shoulders. Questions that had been merely shadows in the corners now stepped forward with the manners of things that want to be answered. Would he return by the same gate? Was the leaving a visit or a vanishing? The rosemary trembled as if in expectation. If this gentle story touched your heart, subscribing keeps this quiet little corner alive. Days learned the house as if it were a new language. They came one after another with the same soft insistence that had taught the man to fold his coat a certain way, and the cat to roll itself around his ankles each morning. But the meters of time measured in small tasks, the kettle's bellow, the sound of the postman's boots, the settling of the house at dusk, began to break like a shoreline struck by little, relentless tides. The cat marked each small loss with a behavior that was not at first remarkable. It sat longer by the hearth. It blinked slowly at the empty chair. It lay across the man's slippers as though to keep their shape warm. From its posture there radiated an urgent patience, an animal waiting that was not idle but rather organizing itself around absence. At first, the world outside the gate continued to play its weather. Markets unfolded on their usual rhythm. Mrs. Hargreaves's cart squeaked at the corner. The boy with the violet scarf practiced skipping in the lane. Neighbors carried their affairs in a tidy and different way. Yet small things attract attention. When the letter bag did not find its usual handprint on the stoop, or when the milk bottle went untouched on the step for 2 mornings in a row, conversations narrowed and then pointed. People do not look for absence until the absent thing was doing the looking for them, and the cat had been looking for the man as if he were a window left open at dusk. Mrs. Hargreaves came round because she had come round before, and because she liked to think of herself as one of the house's custodians. She stood on the path and called the man's name with the same soft, rehearsed voice a person uses when testing the strength of a forgiving fence. The cat answered with a small, quick mew and pressed its side against her calf. She bent and stroked it, and then looked up at the closed curtains with a face that arranged itself into a question without daring to form it aloud. She touched the latch, found it unlocked, and stepped inside, her sensible shoes quiet on the boards. The house smelled the same as always. Lavender, boiling water faintly remembered, dust warmed by slow afternoon light, but smelled also of a pause, like a breath held too long. She moved like someone cataloging a museum. A cup set half full on the table, a folded newspaper with a corner of the biscuit still crumbled upon it, a coat draped over the chair. The cat led her to the hearth where the man's chair sat, emptied. Mrs. Hargreaves's hand met the photograph with the softened corners, and she smiled a small, private smile that contained both compassion and the want of explanation. Perhaps he went to town for a day, she said, the phrase both an attempt and a prayer. She left with the kettle on the stove, watered the rosemary with the light deliberation of someone who believes in the redemptive powers of green things, and tucked a note to the postman under the doormat. If he hasn't returned, please let me know. M. The postman, Tom, was younger than the house and carried his world in a satchel that smelled of paper and habit. He came the next day and tapped the glass, and the cat showed him the habit of its waiting by walking across his boots and winding about his legs until he laughed aloud, the sound like a small, bright bell. He left a message with the boy at the corner shop. Keep an eye out. The boy promised and meant it for the time it took to tie his shoe. The days folded. Each morning the cat performed the ordinary liturgy of the house with a new punctuated insistence. Waking at the hour the man had always risen, padding to the foot of the bed as if to remind him, visiting the kitchen to lay a paw lightly upon the kettle where the man had once placed his hand, sitting at the window to watch the road like a creature attending court. The rosemary grew a little leaner, as though mourning by degrees, and the ivy pressed its green face closer to the glass. The plants, in their slow way, kept faith with the place, bearing the weight of the man's brief presence like votive offerings. Rumors arrived in small, polite packages. One neighbor said that the man had been seen in the market looking pale and folded around himself as if he were cradling a rumor. Another said a taxi had taken him away with a trunk of soft clothes. Each report was a soft pebble thrown into a still pool. The ripples moved out, grew, and then were carried away. The cat, not sure which pebble might hold the truth, learned to measure scent like months, tracing the man's aroma on the path to the gate, on the postbox, on the bench near the baker's where he had liked to sit and feed crumbs to a bold pigeon. On the fourth morning after the leaving, a thing was found, the coat. It was the man's coat, hung on the stair balustrade just as he had left it, the breast pocket swollen with a folded paper that had been forgotten in the hurry of departure. The cat discovered it by insinuating its head into the sleeve, then emerging triumphant with a corner of the paper between its teeth. It dropped the paper on the hearth and pressed its paw upon it as if to ask permission to open the man's private things. The scrap unfolded under its gentle pressure like a small, secret map. The paper bore a stamp in the careful hand of an official, an appointment, a date, the name of a place whose letters in the cat's mind had the gravity of final measures. The cat, of course, could not read in the human sense, but it could perceive the way the man's scent pooled there, thick and round as sunlight on a table in June. That perfume hook called to the animal. It lay with the paper until Mrs. Hargreaves found it and read the words aloud to herself, the voice tremulous in the corner of the room. An appointment, a weighty phrasing, the mention of a transfer to a place of care, speech that rearranged the map of the man's small life into a path the cat had not been prepared to trace. Now the stakes swelled. The neighbors gathered shy as birds to consult one another. The man's affairs, formerly a small private geography, began to be apportioned into communal concern. Someone fetched a kettle. Someone else put a hand on the cat's back. The cat tolerated these interferences like a general tolerates the fiddles of bureaucracy, with a dignified indifference that could be read as understanding. It was then that the cat made decisions that were not merely feline. It learned shortcuts. The pantry door, which the man had always kept latched for reasons of order, presented a handle that yielded to a determined press. The cat's paw could lift, then slide, then enter. It found tins, small fortunes of fish and oil, and carried the evidence with the deliberate pride of a creature that understood both need and ritual. Mrs. Hargreaves, watching from the other side of the hall, laughed until her eyes watered, and then scolded the cat for making the house seem less respectable. She cooed while she filled the bowl, but even in her laughter there was the tightening that happens when people begin to consider where a life will be kept, when its keeper is no longer able to keep it. A complication entered like a slow, unsmiling messenger. A man in a dark overcoat and an official badge arrived one afternoon with papers that made a sound like footsteps on a stone path. He introduced himself as Mr. Carter, and spoke with a voice that flattened corners as those who habitually worked with forms tend to do. He asked politely if anyone had seen the man, and when Mrs. Hargreaves answered that he had left and not returned, Mr. Carter's expression did not change, but it thickened in a way that suggested he knew more than everyone else combined. "You know," he said at last, "sometimes people—" He paused because the bureaucratic tongue has an art of pausing where softer words might be used. "Need assistance arranging their affairs." His hands produced forms whose sharp smell reminded the cat of the man's coat pocket. The forms contained phrases about guardianship and about health assessments that made the hairs rise along the man's chair, as if from a draft. Mr. Carter asked whether the man had any family, and the answers came in fragments. A son lost to distance, a wife whose name had been glazed in old sorrow, a few old friends who were busy being decently busy. The council, it seemed, had been alerted to a potter's problem, a man who had once been able to manage but now required help. The cat, listening, felt its world pivot on a hinge. What was this assistance but the magic making of new order? A place of care, A decision signed, a person in a uniform with the habit of solving human difficulties by redirecting them. These were changes the cat smelled in the air like the sourness before rain. The man's coat lay there in a slight slouch, and the cat looked at it as if the fabric might answer why the man had left without a noise that belonged to punishment or to farewell. The house seemed to shrink a fraction as the neighbors spoke in lowered timbers. Under increasing pressure, the cat chose an action that would have seemed unlikely a week before. It began to move in the spaces the man had left empty, into the street near the gate and further yet. It had no map, but it had a memory like a compass. It tracked the scent along the path the man had taken and followed it, not in hope alone, but in the purposeful hunger of one who cannot accept absence as a finality. This was not a pet's aimless wander, but an investigation with the patience of a monastic vow. We meet other creatures in such journeys because stories unfold in families not only of blood but of proximity. There was a dog who kept the shop at the lane's end, an elderly hound with one ear that turned toward you like a satellite. He had been fed by the man when young, and so he recognized the cat by a nod that suggested memory more than surprise. The pigeon by the baker's window cooed a sleepy report. The man had sat at the bench watching the world. The cat questioned them with the polite abrasion of a creature used to getting answers through persistence rather than language. A tilt of the head, a prod with the paw. From them it learned the direction of a bench in the high street, where the man had been seen the previous afternoon speaking on his phone in tones that shrank like fabric at flame. The city is rich with scent. It tells stories if one will listen. The cat walked the high street like a pilgrim reading relics. It threaded between legs and lingered by doorways, sampling the invisible threads people left behind. Each bench was a page and each street lamp a punctuation. It found a smell stronger than the rest on a certain seat by the river. Tobacco, the faint perfume of lavender, the precise geometry of his scarf. There, half hidden under the bench, lay a ticket stub. The paper was cheap and thin. The ink bled, but it bore a destination and a date. A journey taken that very morning. At the sight of the stub, something in the cat ratcheted. It carried the scrap delicately to a bin where a boy arranging papers worked and dropped it as if consulting a map. The boy looked up, laughed, and said words the cat understood only as tones. He went to the city. The city, which for the man had been a place of keys jangling and small courtesies, now rearranged itself before the cat's paws into a place where answers might be found, or else the very place where finalities hide their faces. Halfway through its search, the cat paused at the bakery and lifted its head into the warm air that smelled of sugar and yeast and townspeople's small contentments. The baker took pity and tossed a crust. The cat ate with the tempo of one who may soon face a long road, savoring not want but the presentness of flavor. It had become, in the space of a week, a creature less of the hearth and more of the road. Yet something in the old pattern of the house tugged at it, a rhythm that said there should be a guiding hand and not only the tremor of neighborly care. Have you ever had an animal wait for you when you didn't ask them to? Do you believe they keep vigil in the way people pray, quietly with the precision of those who have nothing but time? The question sits in the story like a gentle stone. It asks you to remember the patience you once received and perhaps did not merit. The cat found clues that leaned toward inevitability. On a bench by the bus station, it discovered a photograph that the man had carried, a face smiling with a softness like knitted wool. The photograph had the crease where it had been folded into his wallet. A woman in a navy coat stepped out of the crowd and, seeing the cat, crouched with a rapid calculation. Her hands were quick as paper and kind as small faith. They offered a voice. "Is this your cat? He seems to know you." Her eyes were the color of certain winter light, and she wore a badge that read, in small print, Community Liaison. She smelled of the hospital, antiseptic, and flowers. She picked up the photograph and examined it with a steadiness that did not startle the cat. "He had a bag," she said, "and he told the driver he was going north to manage something. His name is on the ticket." The cat, by virtue of the photograph, had answered a human's question. The woman smiled as if this were a small miracle. She snapped a quick picture with a telephone and then, with a cautious, bureaucratic tenderness, she asked whether the cat might be taken to the station office while they searched for any records. This was the moment of the turning. The cat's map had led it to human helpers who possessed both goodwill and administrative muscles. There would be forms, there would be signatures, There would be the slow legal hum of things that reassign lives when lives are at risk. The decision the cat made, to go with the woman to the station office, to cross the threshold into places governed by names and ticked boxes, was small in motion, but vast in consequence. It meant swapping the immediate warmth of the house for the uncertain cold of public spaces. It meant exchanging the man's direct dominion for the community's sympathetic arrangements. In that exchange, the story changed lanes and could not easily return to its previous course. The cat permitted itself to be coaxed, and in being coaxed, it rode the city's arteries like a small ship put to sea. The agents who gathered at the station were a combination of kindly and formal, a nurse who smelled of stew in evenings, a clerk who kept the time of arrivals with a mechanical affection, a woman from adult social services whose glance did not avoid the land where decisions are made. They checked lists and pockets and records, and at last a thin, official paper materialized, a notation of an appointment at a hospital 2 towns away, and an address that matched the hospital stamp on the paper the cat had earlier found in the coat. The paper carried the weight of procedure like a stone in a pocket. Once thrown, it could not be retrieved. There are moments in life when knowing is a kind of motion that cannot be reversed. The cat, listening to the murmured human talk and the tick of the station clock, felt itself standing on the lip of such a moment. The turning point was not a theatrical decision, but the quiet ratcheting sound of fate. Someone had arranged care. Someone had decided the man's next place. The cat's choice to accept the woman's hand and leave the hearth had moved them all into the direction of that arrangement. There could be a recovery. There could be a death. There could be anything that ends or begins in the narrow corridor between one town and the next. The agents, the woman of the hospital, the clerk, the man from social services, spoke with the necessary compassion of their roles. They promised inquiries and they filled forms. They said things that sounded like hope. The cat listened like a soldier at the edge of battle. It wanted a plan with the clarity of maps. It wanted to know the route by which the man might come back. None of them could provide that clarity. They had only an appointment and the rumor of things arranged. It was an answer, but an answer like a half-bridge. It crossed some distance and yet left a gulf. As the afternoon softened, the cat sat on a bench and watched trains come and go. They brought faces and left faces, and the machinery of other people's lives busied itself with a viscosity that made the cat's waiting appear almost heroic in its smallness. Night came and wrapped the station in its shawl of lamplight. The woman in navy offered the cat a small saucer of milk and a square of warmth in her lap. The cat, who had never been fond of strangers' laps, accepted it as if the world had resized and the measures of intimacy had shifted to accommodate necessity. Night was where the complication became a threat. The station emptied of chatter and became a place of echoes. From the station's shadow a small commotion rose, a voice thick with fear, a shoe dropped, a man swearing softly. The cat, with ears like the points of little flags, lifted its head. 2 figures argued near the kiosk, one a stranger with the hard patience of someone who travels frequently, the other someone who had the steady anger of unpleasant tidings. Words slipped out that were soft and metallic. We checked the list, no sign on the forms, nothing logged, transferred. No, not yet. The tone was enough to conjure the worst of possibilities. The woman in navy looked up and checked her phone. "There's been a report," she murmured, and the letters of the sentence landed like a pebble in the cat's pond and made a new ripple. The clerk said, "There's an ambulance report further along toward the turnpike." Mr. Carter's name was muttered like a talisman. Other names hardened like glue. The cat's pupils narrowed. It rose as if to go and then paused. The bench felt like a stage. Then, from the station door, beyond the glare of lamps and beneath the obdurate hum of fluorescent light, a shape detached itself from the dark. A man in a gray coat with a hood that shadowed his face. His steps were measured and had the unpleasant intention of those who come to remove things. He carried a small packet like a mouse in his hand. He paused and looked straight at the cat, and for a small animal second the eyes exchanged the kind of glance that is old as hunger and older than comfort. The cat stepped forward. The man in gray straightened. He bent and put the packet on the bench and walked to the window where the clerk sat. There he spoke in a voice like dry stone. The clerk's fingers stopped on the paper and then continued. The woman in navy's jaw tightened. "You'll want to see this," the man said. The packet contained an envelope stamped with the hospital's mark and a thin slip that bore a single word in the hand of a stranger. Transferred. At that single, thin announcement, the strata of possibility condensed into a tension so keen it could be felt. The word held both relief and dread. Relief because it implied the man had been moved and was alive. Dread because transferred might mean taken out of reach, carried beyond the simple reach of a bench and a small cat's paws. The cat's whole body seemed to pull on an unseen leash. The woman in navy turned to the cat and, with a careful tenderness that had the quality of someone about to perform something necessary but uncertain, said, "We must go then. We must find where they transferred him." It was a decision without a second. The cat rose from the bench as if it had been commanded by a deeper law, the law that binds those who refuse to accept finality, to step through thresholds and ask questions of stone. They gathered quickly. The woman who had first noticed the photograph, the clerk, the man in gray Mrs. Hargreaves contacted on the wire, and the cat as an unspoken fourth. They resolved to move at dawn to the hospital that the paper marked, to set the small engine of community into motion. But night holds things that daylight cannot see, and the corners of stations are full of people who travel with decisions unshared. As they left, the cat looked back once at the bench where the ticket stub had been found, and the spot where little crumbs still bore the ghost of the man's bread. In that shared glance there lay an intention like iron. The cat would follow the trail wherever it led, even if it led to the edges of maps and the cold rooms of institutions. The resolution formed. The small party arranged themselves like a caravan. They had a direction. They had a purpose. Yet before they could set out, before the engines could be heard, there rose the electric lament of a train whistle. And above everything, in the distant thread of sound that runs like a seam through any human night, came a siren from farther down the line. The woman in Navy's phone buzzed. She read the text and paled. Words that said accident and unconfirmed, and a place not listed on any transfer formed a new knot in the story's string. The cat felt the tightening stitch of danger. It stepped toward the platform's edge, tail curved, ears flagging. The men and women around it shuffled and spoke in low motions. Go, wait, no, hurry. The situation pivoted. The hospital slip had promised transfer. The station had promised a route. The siren had promised disruption. Each promise pulled in a different direction like multiple hands on a single rope. They hurried out into the night with the cat tugged by the will that had begun to feel like its own. The carriages rolled. Tires against wet tarmac sang a wet, small symphony. They drove to the address. The lights were pained and thin as a last white nail in the sky. At the hospital gates, the world smelled of disinfectant and rain and fear. The woman with the badge spoke quickly with a nurse who smoked in the doorway, because the staff smoke like sailors do when the sea is rough. They were told the man had been admitted earlier that morning. They were told his name was listed. They were told there had been an incident at a turnpike, but nothing could be confirmed until the records were checked and the family, if there was family, had been notified. "You have a cat?" the nurse asked with a sharpness that was not unkind. The cat sat on its haunches as if to say, "I am here." Then the nurse tilted her head and, in a voice that carried both the caution of professional habit and the tenderness of fellow human beings facing the weakness of one of their own, she said, "There is a locker there and there is a folded coat that matches your description. It was found near the turnpike." "But she paused, and in that pause the night deepened. The pause was a cliff edge. The nurse's mouth formed an unreadable shape, and the cat felt the ground drop away like tide water. The world narrowed to the space between what had been said and what was being withheld. Behind the nurse's eyes something moved, a memory of a face, the bristle of concern, the small decay of certainty. The cat stepped forward as if to answer the unspoken, and the nurse reached down and lifted its chin. "Keep him with you," she said in the voice that is used for children and animals and those who cannot protect themselves. "We'll find out. We'll find him." They were within sight of answers, but the shape of those answers was folded like a letter not yet opened. The cat could feel it. Either he would face the man alive and bewildered, or he would find a void where the man should be. The night held both possibilities like two hands clasped. Then, beyond the sliding doors through which nurses flitted like moths around lamplight, something else happened that made the small party freeze as if struck. The station phone in the clerk's hand crackled with words that were not yet for them. A dispatcher's terse voice, the sound of someone reading a log. The clerk's face reddened. The words skittered out and landed like stones. Body found near the turnpike. The voice on the line murmured, "Unknown identity. Pending identification." At that phrase, the world's air changed its taste. The cat heard it in the small, dry place behind its teeth where decision and fear mix. It felt it in the marrow of its paws. The man's coat lay at the hospital locker, waiting like a sign. And yet in the mere pronouncement of an unconfirmed body, there was a dreadful symmetry that suggested permanence. The nurse's hand tightened on the cat's fur. Mrs. Hargreaves let out a sound that was more wolf than word. The clipping lights above their heads bent like bowed faces. Everything that had been moving toward a hopeful retrieval wavered on the edge of a cliff. The cat's world, which had been measured in the rhythm of a kettle and a touch behind the ear, had stepped into a landscape where no small creature should have to decide the weight of a human heart. The choices assembled like clouds to search, to wait, to be taken away to a new home, to insist on a presence no longer guaranteed. The cat, whose entire education had been in constancy, felt its old certainties dissolve like salt in rain. It stood in the hospital doorway, tethered by courage and fear, and with the lamplight carving its small face into a mask of resolve. The night drew its breath. Beyond the doors there were forms to fill and bodies to be identified. Beyond the siren there was the hard geometry of consequence. The cat did not know yet which of the two paths, retrieval or finality, would be written in ink upon the man's record. They stepped forward together, the small party and the animal that had become their shared question. Each step into the hospital hallway drew them further from the safety of the hearth and the little sovereign domain of the gate where, only days before, the man had simply walked away. They passed under the lights whose bleachiness turns the world into a white page. In the distance, down the corridor where nurses hurried, a door closed with a soft, precise sound that had the meaning of a book being shut on a chapter. It was there, at the corridor's bend, that the world offered its final interruption for Act 2. A man from the coroner's office stepped into the light with a small, dark book. He approached with the careful step of one who has measured grief before. The woman in the navy turned and looked at him, and the cat met his eyes. And in the coroner's hand the book was the size of a promise that would be either kind or terrible. He opened it and read a name. He read it slowly, as if tasting each letter. The name that he read, which would tell them whether the man was to be returned to his hearth or to a ledger of persons without an address, was not yet allowed to be heard by those in this small assembly. The corridor held its breath. The cat's whiskers trembled. A silence wrapped around the syllable before the coroner spoke it aloud. It was a silence that contained the full force of the cliffhanger, the possibility that the man lay somewhere beyond rescue, and the possibility that he would be found and returned, and that these nights of waiting would be woven into a new patch of days. The coroner's lips parted, but at that precise instant the hospital lights flickered, as if to underline the uncertainty of the next word, and the corridor door opened upon a nurse who, with a hand raised to the mouthpiece of her radio, said one sentence that would throw the story into its new gravity. "There's been a mistake, an ID mix-up on the stretcher. We need time to confirm." The breath that had been suspended slipped away like steam. Around the cat the adults exhaled tangled breaths of hope and terror. The page had not been turned. It had not even been unfolded. The decision, whether the man would be reclaimed or claimed by the indifferent paperwork of death, hung like a lantern in wind, swaying, uncertain. The cat stepped forward as if to pierce the omerta with the small certainty of a warm paw. And so the tale reached its cliff, the turning point where the only way out is through. The neighbors waited in the hospital's brittle light. The woman with the badge peered at the coroner's book and then, as if translating a language of the damned into one of possible mercy, bowed to the small creature at her feet. The cat, feeling the weight of all expectation, lifted its head. The last sound before action was the thin rattle of the radio and the nurse's small, apologetic voice. "We need time to check. Please wait here." They waited. The cat waited. The world, having folded in on itself, held the next revelation like a thing wrapped in paper. And then the story paused, poised at the edge, not yet having told whether its ending would be of return or of loss. The hospital had a way of naming time by its lights. The fluorescent strips that made skin into paper and corridors into ruled lines. The small lamps that softened faces into confession. For the cat, The place was a place of smells and echoes, a cathedral of antiseptic and hurried footsteps. It moved through the hospital as one moves through a remembered city, with the quiet confidence of a creature who knows the stanza of a route by heart. The woman in the Navy who had first taken the photograph walked ahead, her stride carrying both purpose and a kind of tired patience. Behind her, Mrs. Hargreaves clutched a knitted muffler, as if it were a talisman against fear. The clerk held a list of names like an invocation. The man in gray from the station carried a small leather case whose weight made his shoulders set. And the cat went between them all, a small dark punctuation that pulled meaning from every scent. Rooms opened like shells. Nurses moved with the light efficiency of people whose hands know both roughness and remedy. The cat's whiskers twitched at the sound of distant beeps and the sight of curtains that moved like slow tides. It had never before been in a place where decisions were written in forms and made by people who had learned to say difficult things without letting their voices tremble. Here at the corridor's bend, an office door stood ajar, and an orderly with soft shoes informed them with a practiced solemnity, "We have a temporary hold on identification. There is a man in 214. He is stable for now. Visitors are limited. His name?" Mrs. Hargreaves asked, though she already knew the syllables by muscle. The orderly read the ledger, and the name landed like a small stone in the pool of the night. The man's name. There was an intake date that matched the paper, an arrival stamped with time, a notation that the coat had been found near the turnpike. The weight of bureaucracy had turned itself into a shape they could touch. The woman in navy moved with the legal softness of those who are obliged to be both careful and kind. She spoke to the nurse at the nurse's station and then to the doctor who smelled faintly of peppermint and haste. They negotiated a small permission, a brief visit, a moment at the bedside if the staff could spare it. Policies rustle. Compassion sometimes finds a small seam in the fabric of rules. They were given a narrow window. It was now or never. The corridor to room 214 was a little mouth the cat passed through on silent paws. Inside, the room air tasted of warmed linen and a cough that belonged to other nights. Machines punctuated the quiet with the regular breathing of monitors. The man lay in the bed like a small country folded into itself, his jaw slack, face drawn in the way of those who have spent a long time in other weather. Tubing ran like fine threads across the white of his arm. A bandage curved at his temple where hair had been shaved for reasons the cat did not know, but whose edges smelled of something clinically clean and final. The light made the furrows of his forehead into map lines. When the cat saw the man, its whole memory sharpened into one simple, immediate recognition. This was the smell: tobacco, lavender, a certain powder of the jacket, and the cat's chest moved with a precise rhythm as if to account for the man's breath. The animal approached the bed not as an interloper but as a returning thing. It hopped up to the edge and then, with the concentrated audacity of creatures who have chosen a path, it leaped to the chair nearest the bed and, when the moment came, onto the bed itself. A nurse started to object but stopped when the woman in navy spoke in a soft, commanding tone. "Let him be. He's come all this way." The cat walked along the man's blanket like one who reads a story line by line, and then settled at his feet. It placed its paws upon the cover and then, with a gravity that was almost ceremonial, it climbed to the pillow. It laid its head upon the man's hand where the skin creased and smelled and remembered. The man's fingers twitched once at the touch like a reed sensing wind. The cat closed its eyes and began to purr, a small, steady engine that in the hush of the hospital felt nearly obscene, so soft and insistently living was the sound. The cat's purring was not music only. It was a summons. It was an insistence on continuity, as if the vibration could stitch wrongness back into rightness. It vibrated against the man's palm, and then the man's hand moved more clearly, a flex of intention. The nurse leaned close and checked the chart. The doctor watched the monitors with the abrasion of one who has let hope be an artifact and must measure it carefully. The woman in navy put one hand on the cat's head as if to steady it, as if to say that the small creature's courage must be shared now. Then the man, somewhere between the remembered map of days and the dark water of sleep, made a sound that was not quite a word. His breath hitched and the corner of his mouth twitched. A single tear formed in the fold of his eye and slid like a small river down the cheek. The cat raised its head and blinked slowly, the way it had when the man had once told a small joke in the kitchen and both had been younger. The room inhaled. There was a movement in his fingers, an attempt that was all will. The man's hand found the cat's fur and closed upon it as if to anchor himself to the world. He sighed, a breath that seemed to gather scattered hours and fold them into one. The doctor murmured an utterance like a prayer. He's responding. Machines charted a slight rise in pulse. The nurse, whose professional distance had melted into something like wonder, placed the stethoscope and found a heart that was awake enough to take counsel. Words came slowly, as if carried across a wide field. A throat clearing, a swallow, a mouth forming air into sound. The man's voice was the brittle thing people get when memory has been made to cede territory. He mouthed something that the cat heard like the clink of a well-tuned bell. The woman in navy leaned forward and caught the syllable as if it were a fragment of scripture. "Cat," he said. The cat's ears pricked. The fingers tightened swiftly. His eyes, cloudy with the sediment of sleep and whatever fever had come to visit, rolled to focus. In those eyes, the cat saw something that was more than sight, a recognition that was raw and older than speech. The man blinked, and in the blink there was the fight of a man reacquainting himself with the map of who had lived alongside him. The cat pressed its head into the palm, and the man's face drew like a tide toward shore. The room was smaller now, narrower and more intimate. The nurse's shoulders slacked. The orderly's mouth went dry with the suddenness of the small miracle. Even the man in gray, who had come with forms and a face trained in the resolution of difficulties, had the corners of his mouth climb into something that almost resembled a smile. The cat purred, not loud but deep as a well, and the sound filled the bedroom of the room. "Joseph?" the man breathed. The name pointer not perfectly formed but present. It was the name the man used in the quiet of the house when he called to the wind. The name the neighbors had heard him use when telling trivial stories of days past. It was a syllable with the weight of history. Mrs. Hargreaves's hands flew to her mouth, and the woman in navy tightened around her badge with a gratitude that looked like a prayer. The strange, decisive thing about moments like this is how they gather people, like petals bending toward a single sun. In a few shallow, halting breaths, the world promised to reweave itself. The cat, whose life had been a ledger of small attentions, took the man's fingers and squeezed as if to say, through the motion of warmth, that it was there and that the order of things could, perhaps, be mended. He opened his eyes further, and when sight finally collected into steadying shape, there was something tender and bewildered in the focus. He looked at the cat as if looking at a weather that had come round again. He smelled the scarf the cat carried in its memory of him, and made a sound like a laugh and a sob braided into one. The doctor wrote in his pad like a person registering the miraculous. The nurse set a hand upon the man's forehead and felt the slow cooling of fever. The cat, patient as only certain animals are, rose and moved to curl at his chest like a living emblem. Then the man tried to speak clearly, and what he said bent the room into a new direction. "I didn't mean to leave." The small confession unclipped a dozen small truths. The man's voice trembled with apology and with something like shame. It carried the weight of someone who had found himself at the edges of choice and stepped in fear. Mrs. Hargreaves answered with a softness that compensated for the world's small cruelties. "You didn't. You went away needing help. We were worried." The woman in navy set a hand on the man's palm and said the formal words that, in the mouths of officials, try to make the world comprehensible. "You're safe for now. We'll make sure you have help." The cat lay at his center, a steadying presence that seemed to fill the tense architecture of the room with the matter of simple things. Purring, warmth, the small act of breathing in rhythm with the one whose hand it warmed. The man's eyes slid closed again, a tenderness of fatigue, and when they opened there was a moment where recollection and confusion wrestled like two boys in the dusk. He began to name things at random: sunflowers, a recipe, an old chore, as if recollection were a pantry where he rummaged for the right cup. Each item he named was a small victory. Each name that landed reconstituted a part of his life. The decisive turn came with touch. The cat, who had been the map of the house in fur and silent habits, moved its head to the man's temples and, with a feline gentleness, began to clean his cheek. It licked the skin where the bandage had been. It groomed with a tenderness that is trained into animal muscle, and yet reads like benediction. In that small ministrative action, the man's face softened and lines smoothed as if someone had taken an eraser to the creases of worry. A nurse adjusted the drips and checked the monitors and then, with the cautiousness of professional hope, called for a social worker. Drip by drip, the man's forms of life collected around him. medication, a notebook where someone wrote in a steady hand, a plan for assessment. There were things to be done, names to be called, permissions to be signed by hands that trembled less than hearts. There was talk of a care plan and of contacting the son, tasks that turned the individual into an object of communal agency. The man clutched the cat, and for a blink the room became a small triangle of home. Yet the world will not reweave itself without strain. There are places where fate pulls the seam too tight, and something must break or some secret come unstuck. The nurse, smiling too quickly because there are no other words that fit, stepped away to ring through necessary calls. The doctor asked for a detailed history, and the neighbors supplied what they could: the coat, the ticket stub, the description of the man's habits. The man listened as if bits of himself were being returned piecemeal. Then, when the pulses of relief had barely steadied into a cadence, a new noise intruded, the thin, high alert of a code down the corridor. The sound hospitals make when another story requires immediate attention. Heads in the ward turned like sunflowers reacting to a distant brightening. The orderly left in a flurry, and the woman in navy checked her phone and then frowned. The clerk's face went blank, and the man in gray constricted at the jaw. Another case at the turnpike, the doctor murmured, and he stood to go, already operating as a finger on a lever. We must see to it, but... He stopped because medical men are forced to prefer one life when multiple presses are applied at once. The nurse glanced at the monitors and then at the cat. The cat, sensing the shift, bristled slightly, and its purr fluttered like an ember. In that instant, where momentum threatened to turn mercy into a poor arrangement, the man clutched for a word he could not quite form. He opened his mouth, and for a sliver of time the room held the smallest, most fragile expectation. Perhaps he would ask to be returned home. Perhaps he would call for his son. Perhaps he would speak the name of the woman who had left a smell on the pot. The man's throat worked as if he meant to speak, and the cat hummed against his wrist with the solidarity of a warm presence. Then the door at the end of the corridor thudded open, and a voice, strained with the kind of urgency that rearranges kindness into action, broke the narrow spell. The coroner's assistant had come back from checking the log, and the color on his face was too grave. He said in a line so short it sounded almost like a hinge, "There's been another identification issue. We've cross-checked, there may be two similar names. We need immediate confirmation." This sentence dropped into the room like a stone into water. The circles widened and the surface rippled into unease. Chronologies that had begun to form unspooled at the edges. The man's fingers clenched around the cat as if to anchor himself against a sea that had not yet made its mind up. Mrs. Hargreaves squeezed the muffler until the stitches crested white at the knuckles. The woman in navy bowed her head and then, in the professional quiet of someone who has learned to steady others, said, "We will confirm. Please remain calm." But in the space between the plea and its reception, something large pivoted. The nurse checked the records again, and then, with the small horror of someone who has seen the ledger of life accept a new ledger, she said, "There is a possibility that the body found at the turnpike might not be him. We have two jackets, two similar ticket stubs. Her words skidded into the room and left dust. The man's face shifted as if someone had drawn a curtain. He looked at the cat, then at the hands that held forms, then at the door that opened onto corridors of rational concern. His hand trembled. He reached up with a slow decision and voice thin as cobweb asked, "Is it my coat?" The nurse turned, and then time resumed the tiny mechanisms of its machinery. The check of pockets, the lifting of linings, the matching of threads. The coroner's assistant returned, jittery with the professional burden of names and forms. He carried the coat, yes, his coat, folded, with pockets that smelled of the road and paper and something that might be rain. He unfolded it on the chair and laid it before the man like a map. There were receipts tucked within. There was the small paper of an appointment. There was the seam that had been mended years before by the man's own clumsy stitch. Everyone leaned forward as if the small tilt of fiber could determine the fates of months. The doctor checked the trove of identity, with the ritual of one who knows the limits of hope. And the man, trembling, reached for the coat and pushed it toward his face. He inhaled deeply, and the scent of his life, tobacco and lavender and the faint oil of old leather, flooded him. He made a sound like a name, and then, with a sudden wave, all the tension that had been collecting rushed to a crest. Outside the room, a door banged and distant voices rose. Some other event had demanded the hospital's attention. Within, the doctor's pen hovered over the chart of the man's life. He looked up and said evenly but with an edge, "We have to confirm with dental or fingerprints. There's a protocol." It was the last human sentence that would be spoken before the shape of the story reasserted itself in an animal way. The man's breath grew shorter and his eyes darted as if trying to catch a fading bird. He turned to the cat and, with the small insistence of someone who always had a corner of courage left, he whispered, "If I go, do not leave." The cat, which had felt the full inventory of his gestures and the sediment of his scent, understood that whispered plea in a way that did not need language. It coiled its body as if to make itself a home and looked up. The man's fingers tightened around a corner of the blanket and the monitors ticked their patient song. Then, at the height of the moment where rescue and reckoning met, the emergency alarm from down the corridor rose again, and the doctor, with the authority of a person torn between duties, was called away to a more pressing crisis. The nurse promised she would return in minutes that always stretch into hours at a bedside filled with need. The woman in navy strode to the doorway with a map of next steps in her head. The clerk wept silently while the man, alone with the cat, looked as if he might confess everything he had not yet had the breath to tell. And as the fabric of the ward pulled them outward and scattered their attention like leaves, the man's eyes narrowed in a way that sharpened his features into a last possible recognition. He opened his mouth and, with a voice hoarse but bright as an ember, began to speak a name, not his own, not the son's, not the woman who had been part of the house, but a name small and private, carved like a prayer. A place, a street, the name of a garden bench where he had fed pigeons. The word left him like a stone cast into some dark pool. It made sense only to the cat in that hushed now, and the cat, hearing the syllable, straightened. The room's air changed into an attentive hush. Then the door at the end of the corridor swung inward and a figure in a hospital coat stepped through. He held a small piece of paper and his face was a map of news. He said with a voice that had the bluntness of consequence, "We've confirmed 2 things. 1, the man in the other body is not him. 2, there's a report from the police. An address was given by the man before he was found. It matches the bench he mentioned. We have to go. Now." The sentence tightened everything to a single rope. The possibility of return and the exigency of movement. The man's fingers curled around the cat as if the animal might be his mooring. Outside, the night deepened into an urgent cold. The woman in navy looked at the doctor and then at the cat, and in the glance there was a question of what the small creature could do that humans could not. In the silence that followed, broken only by the monitor and a nurse's distant footsteps, the man looked at the cat as if choosing whether to trust the world to such a small, determined heart. The cat answered by rubbing its head into his palm, and the man, with the slow deliberation of someone assembling a final courage, managed to say one last thing before they left the room. "If I must go, go with me." They prepared to move. The woman in navy fetched a wheelchair. The orderly folded paperwork into an envelope. The doctor set his hand upon the man's shoulder, with a gravity equal parts medical and human. The cat, aware of the shifting scene, climbed into the wheelchair with the steadiness of one who will not be separated from the life it had kept. They began to roll toward the doors, toward the bright corridor, out into the hospital air that tasted of rain and lamp oil and possibility. And in that moment when the corridor seemed to stretch like a road toward a final possible reconciliation, the man tried to raise his hand to steady himself and his eyelids trembled once more. The monitor's pace hiccuped as if coughing. The nurse's face tightened. The woman in navy urged the orderly to move faster. The clerk mumbled a prayer. The cat, pressed to the man's chest, felt the thins and thicks of a heart trying to hold a promise. Would you stay if you were in their place? When they left the hospital, the night had thinned into a silver gutter of street lamps and the smell of rain that had not yet decided to fall. The wheelchair rolled forward with a steadiness that felt like a small promise. The cat sat where it had chosen to sit, pressed to the man's chest, a warm compass. And the woman in navy walked beside them with a list of names tucked into the fold of her hand. The clerk carried a paper that now seemed less like a decree and more like a prayer, and Mrs. Hargreaves moved with a practical speed that hid the tremor in her ribs. Outside, the ambulance lights had been turned off, but their memory painted the air a faint blue. The man's breathing set a length for the small procession to follow. They went first to the bench by the river because the man, in the thin, fragmentary speech of someone reacquainting himself with days, had given not a hospital name but the name of a place that had once been his sanctuary. It was a small bench beneath a willow that drooped like a sigh over the water. Pigeons walked the stones and accepted crumbs like absolution. When the group arrived, the bench met them with the same quiet patience that had always belonged to it. The woman in navy spoke to a fisherman who had been dozing with his cap in his lap. He blinked, scratched a cheek, and pointed to the path that led toward the turnpike. The man's eyes tracked that path, and in that tracking there was a piece of the puzzle reassembled. They found traces: a cigarette butt crushed under a stone, a ticket stub lodged beneath a bench slat that matched the one the cat had earlier found near the station, a scuff on the gravel where the man's shoes had slid. These were small things, but small things formed the grammar of truth. The cat sniffed them, and then, in the company of strangers who had become something like a temporary family, pressed its head against the man's knee. The man made a sound, a small half-laugh, with the edges of gratitude and embarrassment braided together. The otter, policeman who had been assigned to the turnpike case, arrived with a practical face softened by a thread of curiosity. He showed them a photograph of the coat found near the road, and the man, still slow with the fog of fever and fright, traced the image with a finger that trembled. The officer asked a few factual questions: time of day, the direction taken, any recollection of a vehicle, and the man answered in small, honest details. He remembered the bench, the pigeons, a sudden dizziness that had taken him like wind through a cup, a boy with a bicycle who had lent him a hand. The boy had called an ambulance, leaving the coat where the man had been found. That's the sort of thing that happens when a spell drops over you, Mrs. Hargreaves murmured, and then, as if offended by the softness of her own remark, straightened and said aloud, "You should have told someone you weren't well." The man's mouth formed an apology that was the size of a surrender. He had not told because he had thought he could keep the small machinery of his life running by sheer muscle. Pride, the story kept telling, is a heavy thing to carry alone. The officers checked the coat, matched pockets and receipts, and found the ticket that had been the cat's first clue. The paperwork that had tangled their nights began to loosen by the patient tug of proof. There had been a misfiled record at the ambulance dispatch. The stretcher had been logged under a similar name, and a body had been mistakenly logged as the man's when it was a different person who had been found further down the road. The coroner's office had been notified and then re-notified. The wheels of officialdom slammed and then ground back into a more correct path. The man's identity, which for a frantic hour had been a thing at risk of being put into the ledger as unknown, was now a settled matter. He existed in the record with the brevity and dignity of his name. There was a small celebration, quiet as the popping of a thin cork. People who had been drawn into the story let breaths out that had been clutched tight as coins. The cat rubbed itself against the man's hand, and he laughed, that small rusty laugh of a man who has nearly been taken and then returned. The woman in navy made calls with the business-like tenderness of someone who knows the steps that must follow. Next of kin, an assessment for whether the man could safely return home, the cataloging of medications. The clerk from the station promised to send any receipts and the photograph to be included in the file. The policeman agreed to file an amended report so the coroner's office could update its record. The man, who had been a coordinate of solitary days, found himself at the center of a net he had not known how to weave, and for which he had not asked. The social worker arrived the next morning with a bag of small, sensible things, a list of community nurses, a pamphlet on home assistance, a promise wrapped in bureaucratic paper. She spoke kindly and clearly. She addressed the man with a calm that did not condescend. "There are options," she said. "You can return home if you have support. We can set up a care package to help with medications and check-ins. Or, if you prefer, there's a day center program where you can have company and help with errands." The man listened, and the cat sat on his knee like a witness who would not allow him to annul what he had learned. The choice he made was not dramatic, because drama is not a common measure for slow awakenings. He chose to go home with structured help, daily visits from a nurse, a weekly call from adult social services, and the arrangement that Mrs. Hargreaves would check in every evening. He signed the paper with a hand that trembled a little, and then steadied as if the act of writing itself had a tonic in it. To accept help, he discovered, was not to admit defeat, but to admit that life had become a shared thing. In his eyes one could see the thread of change, pride unknotted into humility, solitude rewoven with neighborliness. Back at the house, the rosemary on the sill waited with the patience of a tethered belief. The ivy had pushed a green finger through the lattice while the man was away, and seemed to have grown a degree sturdier in his absence. The photograph with its softened corners lay on the mantel like a small witness of continuity. The cat led the way into their old room with a gait like a triumphant small captain returning to harbor. The house received them like an old story that has been read again and found consolations in the margins. The man moved more slowly than he had before, but each action contained the possibility of a new ritual. He placed the coat carefully on the peg and ran his hand along the brass key that liked the palm of his hand. He sat by the window and the cat hopped into his lap. The two of them a single punctuation of life and warmth. Mrs. Hargreaves entered and set down a basket of small groceries and, with the practical kindness of someone who had lived long enough to see the weather of human frailty, she set the kettle on to boil and made toast. It is in such small domesticities that the real work of repair is done. Community took form in neighborly arrangements that felt more like a knitting circle than an administrative program. The baker offered to deliver bread twice a week. The boy with the bicycle who had helped at the turnpike came to mow the small path at the front of the house. The man in gray who had once looked like the species of bureaucracy now brought tea and lent an ear. Mr. Carter from the council, who had arrived in actin hours, too with the crispness of official duty, softened as he learned the names and faces of those he had only known by form. He arranged for a garden volunteer to come and tender the rosemary, and to train the ivy where it needed a gentle guide. The plants were tended as if they were flags of endurance, and tending them became another small ritual of reconnection. Payoffs arrived in the quiet currency of details. The rosemary that had been a symbol of patient waiting was used to season a soup that Mrs. Hargreaves insisted on making for the man's first meal home. The scent filled the small kitchen and seemed to stitch a patch of ordinary comfort into his chest. The ivy that had threaded the lattice at the back now found its way carefully repotted into a container and gifted by the man to the hospital staff who had kept him. In that act there was a return of gift to giver, a small justice for the tenderness that had been shown. The brass key was polished and placed on a chain that the man wore beneath his coat. He said nothing about it, but his movements read like someone who had acknowledged the fragility of keeping things and resolved to keep them more carefully. The cat continued to be not merely a pet, but a talisman. Hospital staff called with updates and with a tone that had grown warmer than it had been. They asked after the creature that had walked to the ward, and the man, with a flush of pride he hadn't known he possessed, told them the cat's name aloud and laughed in such a way that it sounded like the beginning of a story retold. The cat slept now in the hollow of the man's arm, and in the presence of neighbors who had become part of his scaffold, measured the house with contented yawns and the diligent rubbing of fur against ankle. It seemed to know in that creature's way that is often wiser than words, that the work of keeping a human whole was not its own, but that it could be the gentle insistence that nudged the human toward community. There were also soft reckonings in the man's interior. He found himself in moments of quiet, coming face to face with the reasons he had walked away in the first place. Pride had been mixed with a fear of becoming a burden. Loneliness had been tangled with an unwillingness to rewrite the terms of his days to include others. These were not sudden revelations but unrolling threads that, when taken in hand, required slow and steady attention. He apologized to Mrs. Hargreaves and to the woman in navy not for their care, but for the way his silence had made them work for answers he might have provided. The apologies were small and honest and habit-forming. In the evenings, neighbors came by with small gifts, a knitted scarf that smelled faintly of dish soap in the comfort of hands, a jar of honey, a packet of seeds for the garden. They ate at the table in a small, uneven congregation that did not demand dramatics but required presence. The man began to read aloud again, and the cat listened in the old way and occasionally corrected the pronunciation of a word by tapping pages with a paw. There were days when the man still felt tired and moments when the fog closed his naming, and he would look at the cat and feel a sharp, lonely ache. In those instances, a neighbor would come and sit with him and drink tea and speak of trivial things, the weather, the bakery, the boy's bicycle, and in the accumulation of trivialities the man found the scaffolding he needed. One afternoon, in the small and ordinary miracle that comes when people do not overstate kindness but do it anyway, a letter arrived addressed in a hand the man recognized, a son's name inked in a script that had once been familiar and now felt like the reopening of a room. The son wrote that he had been delayed by his own dealings with distance and life, but that he had been sent the hospital's notice and was making plans to come. The man's hand shook as he read. There was a quiet courage in the way he folded the paper and placed it in the drawer where he kept the photograph. He did not at that moment know what the coming visit would demand of him emotionally. He only knew that the possibility of reunion had opened like a door he could not close. Healing, they understood, would not be complete in a single night or with a paper signed. It would be the patient architecture of days, the building of new habits, and the slow correction of old neglect. They planned visits from a nurse 3 times a week and an occupational therapist once a fortnight. A volunteer would come to take the man for small walks and to ensure he ate well. A neighborly Rhoda would check in on him at evening. The cat would remain his constant companion, allowed on the bed and in the chair and at the windowsill. A small card from the hospital staff read simply, "For the cat who found him." There were questions left to answer, slower ones that do not yield to immediate motion. How to repair certain friendships, whether the man would ever forgive himself completely for the way he had gone away, what the son's reception might be when the two of them sat in the same room and had to make sense of years. Such questions were not meant to be hurried. They were the kind of things that required the long patience of Rosemary, the small endurance of Ivy. In the hush of the evenings, rituals returned and were gently altered. The man fed the cat and left a small plate for those who popped by unexpectedly. He walked slower, but with the satisfaction of someone who had been spared a bad fate and now wanted to be useful in small ways. He began to write in a notebook again. Lists, notes, small meditations. And sometimes the cat would sit on the page as though to press its own opinion into ink. He learned to ask for help and to accept it without shame. This learning was not a single heroic moment, but 1,000 tiny corrections that hardened into new habits. And there was a quiet moral to what had occurred. An unfussy truth the neighborhood accepted without sermon. People had rallied not because they sought recognition, but because community, like certain herbs, thrives with a little tending. The man's crisis became a lens through which each neighbor discovered an appetite to be better, kinder, more vigilant. Mr. Carter from the council, who once arrived with papers and a manner of finite solutions, now visited with an armful of seedlings and a book of practicalities. The baker left bread not as charity, but as an invitation to breakfast. The boy with the bicycle came and stayed for tea and listened to stories of pigeons and river benches like they were sagas. Have you ever felt a small creature pull your life toward something truer than you thought you needed? Has an animal ever changed your life in a way you didn't expect? The question sits soft and patient in the air like the cat on the sill. It asks for memory and invites confession. As weeks gathered, the man's form settled into a steadier shape. He did not pretend to be what he had been before. He learned to live with a new arrangement that included the presence of others. When the sun finally arrived, the meeting was neither melodramatic nor purely simple. It was a slow negotiation, some awkwardness, some tears, some small laughter at a remembered joke. They sat at the table and the cat slithered between their legs and, in that small act, married the old life to the new. The son listened to the man explain, haltingly, with the willingness of one grown older than his guilt, why he had walked away. The son, for his part, offered explanations of his own absence that were not excuses but reasons: work, distance, guilt, fear of old quarrels. The river between them required patient bridging. They started by mending small things: the exchange of recipes, the sharing of photographs, the agreement that the son would visit more frequently and help set up a more thorough care plan. And the house, that old architecture of memory, responded as houses do when their inhabitants pay attention to them. The man repaired the chair that leaned to the left. He trimmed the rosemary and planted a new cutting in a pot that Mrs. Hargreaves brought. The ivy was guided along a trellis and given room to breathe. The photograph with the softened corners found a place on the mantel again, but now it shared space with a new photograph of the man and his son, the cat between them, like a tiny bridge. Each plant, each object, each neighbor's visit repaid the small debts of neglect with the surplus of care. By the time the season leaned toward a thin green spring, the man's steps had a steadiness that came from having been carried a little, and then learning to walk again with the help of hands that stayed. He had accepted help without losing the dignity that had mattered to him. He had acknowledged his own weakness and allowed the human net to hold him. The cat, who had at first been the small architect of urgency, continued its modest rule over the house, keeping the man's mornings punctual, the garden tidy, the pillow warm. It taught him without words the truth of mutual dependence. Those who had once watched from a cautious distance now sat at his table with a habit of presence. They did not pronounce moralities. They brought pies and listened to stories. The man taught the boy with the bicycle how to mend a small tear in a jacket, and in return learned how to operate a phone that sent pictures over wires, the kind of small modern skill that looks like magic to people who once counted letters by hand. The social worker came and checked in and smiled at the scene of a life gradually rearranging itself. The hospital sent a card that read, "Cultured and brief. Thank you for your patience. We are glad he is home." The man read it aloud, and the cat insisted on having a turn with the paper by batting it to the floor. It is here, in the settling after the storm, that the story returns to its quieter moral ground. The cat had not performed some miraculous human act. It had done the thing within its nature and thereby nudged the humans to act. Its constancy taught them what kindness requires: attention, small courage, and an unwillingness to let absence become a final story. The man had learned to ask and to accept. The neighbors had learned that belonging is not merely a convenient sentiment, but a daily work. The rosemary and the ivy bore witness to this reconstitution, green and steady, their leaves a testimony to patience and small acts tended over time. In the evenings, when the lamplight lay on the table and the cat purred its patient rhythm, the man would sometimes look at the window where the road met the gate and feel no urgent inclinations to step away again. He understood with that slow clarity that comes only after a near miss, that the world is a fabric that benefits from being held by many hands. He kept the brass key in his pocket, a small charm, and he placed the scarf back in the drawer but left it near enough that the cat could smell it and remind him of continuity. Loose ends had been tied in sensible ways. The coroner's office made its correction, and the family of the other man at the turnpike were notified and offered condolences. The paperwork that had caused nights of fear was amended and filed, and the bureaucrats who handled such matters felt a little less like anonymous instruments and more like people who held the fragile curations of lives. Mr. Carter came by and planted a sprig of rosemary in the garden with a young volunteer, and stayed to drink tea, an act that imprinted him into the fabric of the neighborhood. The woman in navy, whose badge had once been the sign of institutional distance, remained in friendship with the man, and dropped by to bring small bouquets when anniversaries arrived. The falling action, by nature, unwinds tension into steadiness and deepens the emotional truth of the tale. The man had been rescued from a small loneliness that might have hardened into disappearance. He had, with the patient help of neighbors, and the singular insistence of a cat, learned to accept the kindnesses that make life continuable. He was not wholly remade. Old habits have a stubborn marrow. But he had been softened and rewired in the gentlest of ways. The cat, for its part, required no accolade. It continued to do what cats do, to demand attention by giving it, to be the warm center of a household that had learned the value of arriving. The story's immediate threads were tied. The identification confusion was resolved. The man's health had a plan. The house resumed its small rituals. The plants were tended, and neighbors had taken on the gentle duty of watching. There remained larger, softer arcs to be completed: the son's gradual forgiveness, the man's deeper acceptance of community as family, and the ways memory would re-knit itself into stories told over tea. Those would be the province of patience and of small, repeated acts. The cat slept that night on the window seat, where the rosemary's scent drifted over it like a benediction. In its sleep, it twitched at the memory of the road and the bench, at the smell of the man's coat, and at the echo of a human voice that had breathed a single name and been heard. The house, under the steadying touch of neighborhood hands, settled down with the quiet satisfaction of a harp whose strings have been retuned. The falling action's final gift is the realization that lives are not solitary artifacts, but woven things, and that sometimes salvation comes in small pedestrian acts: a coat found in a ditch, a ticket stub kept in a pocket, a cat that will not leave. The man looked at the cat with an affection that had changed from possessive comfort to grateful companionship. The cat answered with easy purrs, and when the man reached to stroke it, curled more fully into the man's hand as if to say the only thing it had ever meant to do was to stay. And so the house hummed again with ordinary sounds: kettle, clock, chair scrape. But the music was subtly altered by the knowledge that the ordinary can be protected by the extraordinary effort of human kindness and the small, insistent heart of an animal. When the long season of repair settled into ordinary rhythm, the house learned to breathe again with a steadier cadence. It was not that the storms had never come, but that someone was now there to close the shutters when wind began to find its teeth. The man's days no longer balanced precariously on a single bent will. They were held in a net of small interventions: nurse visits, neighborly calls, the son's occasional arrival with a bag of groceries and stories of the city, and, within that net, something like safety began, slowly, to feel habitual. He kept his mornings in the same careful way he had always kept them, but with a new margin. Time to sit, to let tea cool, to watch the cat draw little circles on the floor with its tail. He did not pretend the fear that had brought him to the hospital had evaporated. It sometimes rose in thin, tremulous edges and reminded him the world could still tilt if he set his shoulder wrong. Yet that fear no longer had power to isolate him. He had learned to ask for help without feeling that his asking was a theft from dignity. Asking became a kind of honesty, and the honesty brought with it other faces and hands and voices that learned how to carry portions of his day. The cat reigned in the house in ways that were simple and categorical. It took to sleeping on the brass key when the man left for a short outing, as if to guard the promise of his return. It insisted on the same corner of the bench by the window, so that the man might remember to look outside. It kept the scarf near its sleeping place and sometimes, inexplicably, would take it and drag it to the threshold, as if to remind the man of the texture of what had kept him earlier. Once, when a stronger wind came down the lane and rattled shutters like a chorus of small bones, the cat climbed to the sill and sat like a sentinel, while the man tightened the screws on the latch. In the way animals do, the cat's presence made practical things less frightening. It turned each small task into something that could be done in company. The plants repaid attention with gratitude. Rosemary, whose leaves the man had once pressed between his fingers as if they might hold the shape of memory, grew a sturdier green in its pot by the sink. In spring, it produced a courage of little. Blue flowers, and the man learned to cut sprigs and put them into soups and teas to give warm honesty to meals. The ivy that had threaded the back lattice obediently accepted a new trellis and grew with a tidy shame of leaves like someone who has been given a second chance to climb. When the man offered the hospital a plant in thanks for the strangers who had tended him, he took an ivy cutting and carried it wrapped in tissue like a small emissary. The plant's roots found kindness in new soil, and the gesture closed a circle. Tending and being tended emerged as mutual acts. The brass key, that small, round, comforting weight the man carried in his palm for years, became a token of the new bargain he had struck with life. He kept it on a string around his neck now, under his shirt, and when he felt the knot of panic rise, he would rub at the cool metal with his thumb until the world steadied. The key had always been a superstition, a small charm the man liked to test in the center of his palm. Now, after the search in the hospital and the many humans who had some way of saving him, the key had new meaning, proof that one's life can be opened and closed with the help of others, and that keys, like people, are sometimes kept safe by the community that remembers to lock and to unlock. The photograph with softened corners lived again on the mantel, but now it was flanked by other small proofs of survival. A note from the social worker that read, "Plan in place. Daily check-ins." A postcard from the sun that smelled faintly of a city train, and an envelope from the hospital with a card that said simply, "For the cat who would not leave." The room, once a ledger of absence, had become a shelf of small reconciliations. People in the street spoke of the man differently. Where once he had been the quiet neighbor who kept to himself, he was now a figure who was known for having been found and for having accepted being found. Mrs. Hargreaves stopped by to teach him how to knit with 2 needles instead of 1, as if the act of making could stitch a human back into the warm fabric of others. The boy with the bicycle joined the man on a bench to learn the history of a particular photograph and to listen to a pigeon story that had no better telling than the man's rusty voice. Mr. Carter of the council came around and left a bag of garden tools, gruff with apologies and surprising tenderness. The woman in navy, who had seemed at first the embodied bureaucracy, called now as a friend who wanted to invite him to a community tea. The town, which had watched a potential disappearance with harnessed concern, had found a rhythm for keeping watch. The son's visits took on the careful, slow choreography of people building a bridge. He did not burst into the house with triumphant boasts. He arrived with a soft apology folded into accountable schedules. They sat at the table and talked about small things first, the mechanics of a toaster, the practicality of a garden tool, and then, when they had edged slowly enough around the pool of old grievance, they touched on the currents that had once swept them apart. The son learned, perhaps with the humility of someone who has had his own fears to own, how a father's silence can be a loud, lonely affair. The man learned how to hear without collapsing into shame. Their repair was not a single scene of reconciliation, but a series of small, repeatable acts. Shared tea, the son fixing a shelf, the man telling an old story, and the son laughing at the right point. The cat attended these sessions like a judge, impartial, occasionally interruptive, and in its presence the business of mending felt less like duty and more like a natural task. There were nights when the man woke with a taste of panic on his tongue, when voices of earlier loneliness rose like ghosts at the edge of the bed. In those moments he learned to reach for the phone and to speak with Mrs. Hargreaves or the nurse or the son, instead of folding tighter into himself. He learned to trust that the net would hold. He learned slowly and with stumbles to be the kind of neighbor who asked for help without shame and returned it without ledger. That learning moved into other parts of life. He began to write postcards again, small clipped notes of thanks that said more than gratitude. He offered to run the errand to the baker and returned with stories of someone else's kindness. The acts were small. Their cumulative force was enormous. The cat continued to perform its small miracles. Once, on a morning when the wind had shaken at the eaves and the man had been more restless than usual, the cat rose and took the scarf from its sleeping place and brought it gently to the man's lap. It nudged the fabric into his hands as if to say that memory was not a chain, but a thing to warm the present. The man, who had always been awkward with displayed emotion, sat with the scarf against his chest and let a softness spread. He stroked the cat and the purr answered like a tune learned long ago. It was in such small ceremonies that the moral of the tale revealed itself without the didactic hammer. The lesson arrived like rosemary scent, subtle and sustaining. There came a day when the man walked to the gate without the brass weight in his palm, because the key hung at his throat and he did not have to test its coolness to reassure himself. The cat trotted alongside, tail high as a pennon. He paused at the gate and felt the lightness of a person who had been nearly lost and then reclaimed by ordinary hands. He visited the bench by the river where the pigeons clustered and sat with a patient dignity. The son joined him and, in the quiet that rose like a benediction, they fed the birds and traded small confidences. The town's small life carried on, but the contour of it was marginally different. People were quieter in their suspicion and louder in their willingness to help. In the years that followed, the house remained a small center of quiet readiness. The man tended the rosemary. The ivy was trained in neat curves. The brass key was kept on its chain. The cat, who had first acted out of that inscrutable animal insistence that led to the discovery and to the rescue, aged in its own measure and grew gray at the whiskers. It kept its sovereign place on the pillow and on the man's knee, and when it walked it did so with the slow, sure steps of an elder. The two of them, human and cat, became an emblem in the village, a living moral for those who passed by. Do not ignore absence, for small attentions can make palaces of salvage. And then, as all good tales that take the long view must do, came a final gift of the simplest sort. One early morning, when the man rose and found the light already sharpening the corners of the room, he noticed upon the threshold a small, deliberate offering, a sprig of rosemary, tied with a faded piece of ribbon in a knot the cat liked to hide under the chair. The sprig had been clipped and placed as if by a tiny, exacting hand. The man smiled and thought of the neighbors in the hospital, and then looked down to find the cat watching him with the slow intelligence of its kind. The animal's eyes seemed to hold a small satisfaction, a secret kept between them. He took the sprig and placed it into the pot of rosemary, burying it slightly as if to plant a memory inside a memory. It was by any measure trivial, a cut of herb in a pot already full. But by the measure that matters in the life of a household, It was a symbolic reseating. The cat, which often performed acts that felt ritualistic once one looked with the attention of a person who knows things, brushed at the man's hand and purred. In that little movement there was a gift that satisfied all the plants and the brass key in the photograph. The reassurance that the bond of being kept would continue. The cat's action, cutting and placing the sprig, an act of feline ceremony, was not a miracle in the operatic sense, but it was a benediction the man understood with a gratitude that made his mouth brim. Life continued. The son stayed longer visits and sometimes left a note pinned to the door that read, "Call me," with a smiley that looked almost flippant but meant a great deal. Mrs. Hargreaves, and the woman in navy and Mr. Carter and the boy with the bicycle remained the kind of people who show up, usually without pomp but with a steady, unremarkable kindness. The rosemary grew, and in autumn it shed its scent like a small praise to the kitchen where soups were made and bread toasted. The ivy taught new leaves to reach a little more sure of soil. The cat kept its pilgrim rituals, a watch at the window each dawn, a check on the latch each dusk, a soft press of its forehead against the man when the weather was unsure. In the closing months of the man's life, years, after the confusion at the turnpike and the hospital lights and the coroner's uncertain ledger, he sat, often in his chair by the window, and watched the road that had once been a place of flight be now a place of meeting. Children ran their errands past the gate. Neighbors left parcels. The son parked and came in with the easy confidence of someone who knows both the city and the quality of small community. The man's breath had become gentler with the knowledge of being held. When he spoke, he did so with a voice that had learned patience. When he laughed, it was a true sound. The cat, older and slower, attended to him in quiet ministrations that read like a small scripture. On a day when the leaves were turning to the straw gold of late summer, the man rose from his chair with a small, loving difficulty and reached into his pocket. He produced the brass key and placed it into the cat's bed, a surprising, ridiculous gesture to any except those who know households and small ceremonies, and he patted the animal's flank. He thanked it, a human word that in such quiet moments carried a weight as large as any public accolade. The cat looked at him with the clear, unadorned acceptance of its species and purred a slow, contented note that seemed to ring the house like a bell. There is a kind of moral that Rudyard Kipling might have enjoyed, keen, a moral not couched in sermon, but in an observation of the world's wheels, which the man, the cat, and the town together provided without speech. That small, steadfast acts by small people and small animals accumulate into something that resists ruin. Where human pride will often lead a person to walk away, community will put hands to the task of returning them. Where loneliness drills its small caverns, a neighbor's visit or a cat's unblinking devotion can fill the space with light. The universal truth, when set calmly into the cadence of daily life, reads like a couplet. Be present in the small things, and larger mercies will find you. Do not think solitude equals strength, for strength is often the humility to accept being held. And so, in the exact way that endings in honest fables do, the life that might have sealed itself into a sad line instead continued into a slow, generous arc. The man learned to live with the knowledge of his precariousness and to let it make him gentler. The son learned to take the time his father needed, and the neighbors learned that watching is a craft worth learning. The cat, having done what cats do best, in unkept watch, acted on impulse and trusted instinct, aged by the hearth and died long after a life of usefulness, leaving a clean place on the pillow and the imprint of small duties performed well. There is no myth here of a single heroic salvation, rather a chorus of humble actions. The cat's final gift, a sprig of rosemary placed like a small anchor at the man's threshold, was remembered as the emblem of that chorus. It taught that animals give without calculating reward, and that people can learn to accept the giving without shame. It taught that repair looks less like fireworks and more like the steady, daily tending of pots and friendships. If you have read this far, you have been in a small room with them, a witness to the way ordinary tenderness can arrest a disaster and reroute a life. Keep that quiet image near, of the cat by the gate, of the man with his brass key and his scarf, of neighbors bringing bread and stories, and let it be a guide for how you might act when the small crises of daily life come knocking. Gentle attentions matter, steady hands matter. The small, determined heart of a creature will sometimes be what teaches us how to be brave in the right, modest ways. You stayed with me till the very end. Thank you. If it felt like a soft purr in your heart, Subscribing helps me share more stories like this.